Garen Meguerian is a civil rights free speech lawyer with 30 years of experience practicing in the state and federal courts in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. Since 2016, Garen has volunteered with grassroots groups, primarily in Chester County, to preserve democratic institutions. He joins us today to raise the alarm about the threats against Pennsylvania's independent judiciary and the importance of the PA Supreme Court's retention election on November 4th. Hi, Garen. Welcome to The Signal.
Thanks, Cyril. Happy to be here.
3 Pennsylvania Supreme Court justices, Democrats Christine Donahue, Kevin Doherty, and David Wecht, are up for retention for the November 4th election. Now, this typically quiet race is garnering a lot of attention and money, from right-wing billionaire Jeffrey Yass, who wants to flip the court, to MAGA voting activist Scott Pressler and the National Republican State Leadership Committee, obviously, as well as Democrats and the DNC. Pennsylvania State Rep and DNC Vice Chair Malcolm Kenyatta told WHYY News last week that the MAGA GOP, quote, wants to make the Pennsylvania courts a reflection of what we're seeing at the federal courts, where you have judges and justices that are ignoring the Constitution, ignoring the law, and who see themselves as needing to be in line with a certain politician. Why don't we use State Rep Kenyatta's comments as a launching point and look at the U.S. Supreme Court as a way to illustrate what's at stake with this retention election in November?
Yeah. And I think that's terrific. And I completely agree with that sort of framing. Obviously, we're having this discussion today, and everybody listening to this signal is gravely concerned about our democracy. We know that those of us living in this country are in grave peril. And the point of coming on today to discuss how critical it is to hold on to these 3 Supreme Court seats is to enable everybody listening to this podcast to talk to their friends, neighbors, family members, and relay some of what we discussed today to demystify the stakes, to demystify the disinformation. And before we dig into what's happened at the U.S. Supreme Court level, we need to clarify a couple of things, because there has been so much by way of misleading ads and the sort of precision targeting that we saw in the 2024 election. Like, for example, do you remember, Cyril, in the 2024 election, hearing about how Elon Musk was sending different mailers to Michigan targeting Palestinian or Muslim voters with different messaging than he was targeting, voters who might support Israel?
Oh, absolutely.
So that they're pulling that same tactic here in Pennsylvania. Now there are 2 registered Democrats in my house, me and my wife, and we've received no fewer than half a dozen mailers targeting us specifically with messaging that is effectively saying term limit the Supreme Court. And term limits are a fantastic idea for the U.S. Supreme Court, and maybe a good idea for all courts, but not at this juncture. Not when the U.S. Supreme Court has no term limits, and the Pennsylvania Supreme Court typically, these retention elections are just, they're not controversial. There's only been one retention election that a judge has lost, and that was Judge Nigro, following a decision he made to give the judicial branch raises at a time when people were struggling, and he was a victim of the fallout from that. But other than that, these retention campaigns are pro forma. All judges usually get retained, because the idea is that once you get elected and put on that black robe, you are no longer a politician, and and the retention vote is supposed to be just an up and down based on your adherence to the rule of law.
And Garen, let me jump in real quick, because you were
Please.
just speaking about misinformation
Yep.
around these elections. And actually, the Philadelphia Inquirer published an article yesterday on Sunday that's titled, quote, brazen Jeffrey Yass-backed mailer suggests the PA Supreme Court created the congressional map it actually threw out. So
Yeah.
this is like an ongoing and calculated and coordinated, miss, or I would say disinformation, because it's intentional, right?
Yeah.
Like misinformation is just by accident, someone putting out information they may not have known better. Like this, they know better, and they're trying to dupe voters into thinking that, in this case, that the Supreme Court gerrymandered maps, when in fact what happened was that they threw out a Pennsylvania GOP gerrymandered map that would have just distorted local state districts.
Thanks, Cyril, for bringing me back, because that was kind of the point I was trying to make, is that they are targeting Democrats now to confuse the hell out of our voting base. Like, that's what I was saying. 2 Democrats in my house, we've received half a dozen mailers, all saying things that we would normally be in support of: women's rights. They're saying that this, to protect women's rights, we need to get rid of these 3 justices, which is completely the opposite of what we think of, women's rights as being associated with the reproductive freedom and abortion, which these 3 Supreme Court justices will certainly uphold that right in Pennsylvania, and their replacements will almost certainly not uphold that right. So that, and the gerrymandering issue, they're tagging these 3 Supreme Court justices with gerrymandering when they did the opposite, and we're going to talk about that. Like, this is the reason why these 3 justices are being targeted, as they have been since 2018, when they issued their gerrymandering ruling, is because they wouldn't allow unfair maps, and because they interpreted the state constitution as barring unfair maps. So what can we do today to empower voters and listeners to this podcast to take our message and spread it more widely? And I think there's a couple of things we can do. I need everybody listening here to remember something. Just like none of us is going to get any younger than we are today, in an age when we have an authoritarian consolidating power, none of us is going to have any more democratic tools than we have today to resist authoritarianism. So every day that goes past, we have fewer democratic tools than the day before. So I want everybody to think about the democratic institutions that we have lost, some irretrievably, in the last 8 months. If you understand that, then you understand that it is vital that we hold on to whatever democratic institution that we have. And one of those institutions that is currently democratic and at risk of not becoming democratic is the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. So having said that, the other thing I want to do is I want to demystify the way the courts are looked at. I want us, for the purposes of discussing things with our family members, I want us to ignore the black robes and the sophistry of their opinions and regard them as political actors. The right has done this for the last 40 years, 50 years. They have targeted our courts because they have realized that the linchpin to democracy are the judges. Like, if our federal government fell in great part because of the role the U.S. Supreme Court had in assuring its downfall. Okay, so we cannot let the same thing happen in Pennsylvania by refusing to understand how these judges are political actors. The second thing I want everybody to keep in mind is that I want everybody to associate retaining these 3 judges with preserving voting rights. It's as simple as this. If we elect Democratic justices, we are preserving voting rights in Pennsylvania. If we don't, if we allow these justices to lose this retention vote, and in all likelihood, they will be replaced by MAGA justices on our Pennsylvania Supreme Court, we are eroding voting rights in PA. It's that simple. And so we can go through and talk about, why they've been targets. And principally, again, it's that 2018 decision. Like, we as Americans and Pennsylvanians and just human beings have very short-term memories, and we sort of forget what life was like back in 2018, 2017, before these maps were invalidated. Pennsylvania is a 50-50 state, like a lot of other states in the Union. And when you have a 50-50 state that most of the congressional reps are Republican, then something's wrong. You know that people's votes are not counting the same. And that's basically what gerrymandering is. Gerrymandering's got a big fancy name, but what it comes down to is the politicians choosing their voters as opposed to voters choosing their politician. So in today's age, gerrymandering isn't like this quaint practice that the way it was done in the 1700s or the 1800s. With computer technology, sophisticated algorithms, and I hope everybody's paying attention to what happened in Texas and now California threatening to do the same. These folks can draw maps with such precision as to guarantee that they're going to get extra seats, than more seats than they deserve. It's happened over and over again. We've seen it happen in Pennsylvania. We've seen it happen in Wisconsin, North Carolina. It's especially pernicious in swing states, right? In states where you have sort of like 50-50 control. If you allow one branch of government to draw maps in order to keep itself in power, then forget about fair votes. And I understand this topic is a little dense, and it can be boring, but the boring stuff is where democracy lives or dies. I don't know if I've gone too far off the rails here, but bring me back.
Yeah, sure. No, I mean that, in addition to, gerrymandering, which is something that the court kind of protects the voting process from, or potentially can protect,
Yeah.
the court from politicized gerrymandering. How else would the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court impact just kind of voting rights, right?
Okay.
As we
Yeah.
look towards the midterms next year and then to 2028. I know they're still making decisions, like, as we speak,
Yeah.
about voting rights in Pennsylvania. So for example, on Friday, the PA Supreme Court ruled that counties must notify voters if they make a mistake on a mail-in ballot, so that they could
Yeah.
potentially cure the ballot. And that's just something that I would say is as trivial as just putting the wrong date on the
Yeah.
envelope, right?
Yeah.
So and that's just one example. But how else might a Pennsylvania Supreme Court cases or decisions, how else would it impact voting rights and the integrity of elections in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, so that's an unbelievably good question, because I think before we talk about that, we need to understand what the role of the courts is. And for all the folks listening, here's a simple way to think about it. The Supreme Court of the United States interprets the US Constitution, and the Pennsylvania Supreme Court interprets the Pennsylvania Constitution. And unless the Pennsylvania Constitution conflicts with the US Constitution, the US Supreme Court cannot and should not interfere with the way the Pennsylvania Supreme Court interprets our own Constitution. Okay, so that's key, because our Constitution is different than the US Constitution. It has more rights. It grants more rights to its citizens, to the citizens of Pennsylvania. In order to breathe life into those rights as they're articulated in the Pennsylvania Constitution, you need justices to effectively CPR that Constitution and not regard it as dead. You need it. You need those rights to be empowered by the justices who we elect and who we retain. So, depending on how any court interprets the Constitution, any law can be upheld or struck down or interpreted narrowly or broadly, and rights are granted or taken away, all depending on how these courts, and the highest courts, more importantly, choose to interpret their respective constitutions. And what makes the Supreme Courts uniquely important is their ability to set precedent. Like, once they interpret the Constitution in a certain way, the appellate and trial courts, all sitting below the Supreme Courts in hierarchy, are obligated to follow the same reasoning. That's why the effects of the recent Supreme Court rulings have been, the US Supreme Court rulings have been so devastating, right? Like, because they're effectively neutering the entire federal judiciary. You have really, really good judges sitting in the appellate and the district and the trial courts all over the country who have to now follow the dictates of these 6 arch conservatives in the US Supreme Court. So by capturing the highest court, it doesn't matter whether you have a whole bunch of lower court judges who would interpret laws and rules and the Constitution differently. They are obligated, the way our system works, to follow the rulings of the US Supreme Court. Like, take Roe as an example, as an obvious example. All the lower courts were obligated to adhere to the principles of Roe, protecting abortion rights throughout the country, even judges in Mississippi and Alabama. And it wasn't until Dobbs, until that right was overturned, that you had courts, restricting abortion throughout the country. So same thing here with voting rights. With voting rights, Pennsylvania has decided, unlike the US Supreme Court, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court decided that gerrymandering violates our Constitution. So you can't have Republicans draw maps that give them 14 congressional seats to the Democrats' 1 congressional seat just because they happen to be in power that year. Look at the absurdity that's happening in Texas. They're doing a mid-decade redistricting in order to follow the mandates of President Trump to get him 5 more congressional seats so that there's no check on his power after the midterms. God forbid we lose these 3 judges. The same exact thing could be happening here in Pennsylvania with a dictate to the Pennsylvania legislature, hey, get me 5 seats. And if you don't think that's possible, the New York Times, right about this time, used computer technology to see if it could draw congressional districts in Pennsylvania that would literally leave Democrats with 1 House seat, as opposed to the Republicans, massive advantages. So that's what's at stake. In addition, like you pointed out, Cyril, these judges will decide whether to count mail-in ballots or not count mail-in ballots, whether to make a big deal about ministerial clerical errors, like forgetting to put a date on the outer part of the envelope, or they could interpret signature requirements to be incredibly strict. There's all kinds of obstacles to voting that you could, thinking like a Republican, if you wanted to create obstacles to voting, there are many, many ways to do it. We're not quite at the level of poll taxes yet, but who's to say that this U.S. Supreme Court wouldn't allow poll taxes back? There's nothing that I put past them, and it's primarily because of what we're seeing, like the way they're dismantling voting rights nationally is by using these tools of jurisprudence. And do you know what jurisprudence basically is? For those listening, jurisprudence is basically the theory that the judges use in order to dress up their opinions. And the U.S. Supreme Court is very fond of, this iteration of the U.S. Supreme Court is very fond of jurisprudential theories like originalism or strict textualism when interpreting the text in a certain way suits their interests. And originalism is basically this theory that says that the Constitution means today what it meant to the drafters and the ratifiers of the Constitution when it was adopted. So no matter how things have changed, the structure of our government and the Constitution has to remain as it was when it was drafted. So take America back, not just to the 1950s or the 1850s, but the 1700s. So what would be the appeal of originalism to a conservative court? Well, think about who had no rights in the 1700s. Think about who the framers were in the 1700s. So it's not coincidentally, obviously women had no rights. anyone other than white male landowners had no rights. And this theory of originalism would take us back there. And it's not by coincidence that the theory of originalism, or the jurisprudence of originalism, took off after the major landmark Brown v. Board of Education that desegregated schools. So conservatives started appealing to this idea of this lost great age, and started deifying the founders in a way that even the founders would find repugnant. But the key thing here to emphasize is that adopting any given jurisprudence is a choice that is made by these justices. Like, nothing in the Constitution says that it has to be strictly interpreted in accordance with the rules of originalism. To the contrary, you could interpret the Constitution in a way that expands democracy and civil rights. You can interpret it the way the Hawaii Supreme Court interprets its own Constitution, and sees climate change as an existential threat, not just to Hawaii, but to the globe, and gives a lot of power to the portions of its Constitution that protect its natural habitat. So you can use jurisprudence to promote equality. You can interpret it to maximize happiness or liberty. You can make any number of choices. I have a friend who's an educator at Washington Law School. He's a First Amendment professor there, and he's written law review articles about how you can use democracy and expanding democracy as a jurisprudential thought in order to grant more rights to people. So instead of all of those things, these 6 arch conservatives that we have on the U.S. Supreme Court have concocted this originalism theory in order to take us back and bind us, so that we can never like grow as a society. We can never become more equal as a society. We are chained to the rights that we had back when the Constitution was enacted, and even worse. For anybody listening, again, like, jurisprudence, choosing the jurisprudence by which you breathe life into the law, is a political act by political actors wearing black robes, and it has major, major political consequences. Just look at the recent example. You want to create a monarchy, you can certainly interpret the Constitution in a way that does it, as they have. They've granted presidential immunity. Instead of barring an insurrectionist from running for office, they delayed hearing that case until the very last minute in order to assure that there would not be any kind of trial. So all of these things, like, right, we're talking about the U.S. Supreme Court. So all of these things, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court could be doing to us as well, or in the opposite direction, they could be interpreting our state constitution like the Hawaii Supreme Court interprets theirs, and breathing life into democracy, and sort of fostering a more equal democracy here in Pennsylvania. We cannot continue to look at judges as if they are like soothsayers, as if they are the way the Iranians take a look at their supreme leadership. Like, these are not holy men. They are political actors who have been put into these roles in order to serve political ends. That's why somebody like the billionaires Jeffrey Ass and the other billionaires in Texas who are funding these anti-retention votes want these judges gone so critically, because they want the judges they put in their place to do their bidding and not our bidding.
Yeah, I mean, so I think like a good exercise for people to do is just imagine like the U.S. Supreme Court taking over the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court. Imagine
Exactly.
having a Pennsylvania State Supreme Court that has the ideological makeup of the U.S. Supreme Court, and that's what's at stake. And
Yeah.
and this is, as you talked about, like, this is a Supreme Court that's not looking to expand democracy but contract it, as well as essentially kind of just doing, Trump's bidding to kind of, to just remake U.S. election law. I mean, he's talked about banning mail-in voting, which he's not in theory or in legal theory, according to the law, he's not able to do. But this is something that he wants to do, and this is something that is, Pennsylvania state law. And I want to remind listeners that actually the law that created mail-in voting in Pennsylvania was actually bipartisan. Right? The
Yep.
Republicans are always complaining about it because it didn't work to their advantage after they passed it. I mean, someone as far to the right as Mastriano actually voted for that act to create mail-in voting in Pennsylvania.
The funny thing is, like, the Republicans had a massive advantage in absentee voting before that, and they knew it, and that's why they voted that way. And it just so happened during the pandemic when Democrats told their voters, "Hey, bank your vote, get it in, make sure you vote by mail." And then Democrats had a massive advantage in 2020 through vote by mail. That's when Republicans decided they didn't like it. So, like, if the opposite had been true, for sure that the Republicans would be defending mail-in ballots. Instead, their idiot in chief decided to denigrate mail-in ballots and discourage his own base from using a convenient way of voting. And not, and tellingly, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, despite many challenges to that law by Republicans, upheld the validity of the mail-in ballot statute in Pennsylvania. Again, another example of how the Pennsylvania Supreme Court protected the franchise and made themselves targets of these billionaires and the right wing by doing so. And let me say one other thing. The three justices are not exactly like progressive stalwarts. We saw even in last Friday's decision, Justice Wecht dissented from the opinion that would compel counties to correct ballots, right? To correct mail-in ballots. It's not my ideal of what we're facing, but they're calling balls and strikes the way they feel, and that is sort of the role of an independent judiciary. Like, you don't want judges beholden to a certain set of political realities like the U.S. Supreme Court seems to be. Like, the U.S. Supreme Court, at last count, has used its shadow docket to give Trump, I think, his 21st straight victory from all the cases that have gone up to the U.S. Supreme Court. So that is just outrageous. Like, it's lawless, it's outrageous. They are doing things like overturning decades, if not centuries, of precedent on their way to try to appease this president and his administration. And we cannot abide with the same kind of thing happening to our Pennsylvania Supreme Court.
Yeah, I mean, it's an ideologically driven federalist society court,
Yeah.
and I think it's fair to say it's a kangaroo court. If the U.S. media was reporting on this court as if it were in a foreign country, this is how they would be describing it, as a kangaroo court, as a stacked court. And unfortunately, I think a lot of the reporting isn't as vigorous and doesn't really interrogate what they're doing as they should be, or as they would, as if this was a foreign court in a country who we kind of like deemed as an ideological adversary to the United
Yeah.
States. Like, if this was in Venezuela or Cuba, for example, right?
Yep.
The media would be all over the
Yep.
ridiculous decisions and the ideological makeup of this court. But unfortunately, what we're seeing in the media is very, tepid at best. And this is, again, like, what's at stake here, and this is what you've been talking about, essentially, is protecting Pennsylvania from right-wing gerrymandered legislative maps, as well as protecting voting rights. Like, that's what's on the line with this election in November. Now, in addition to that, there's also other issues that the court's going to be ruling on, or potentially be ruling on, moving forward. And one of those things is abortion rights and reproductive rights. Could you talk a little bit about that?
No, absolutely. I mean, if you think the Republicans are going to be content with, state by state decision on abortion rights, you're kidding yourself. Like, they're coming for abortion rights everywhere. They're coming for the pill, even nationally. They're going to use every lever of power that they have to restrict abortion rights. And the minute the Pennsylvania Supreme Court flips Republican, God forbid, you're going to see challenges from the state courts to the appellate courts, the Supreme Court on Pennsylvania's right to abortion. So if you care about that, if you care about environmental rights, if you care about continuing to breathe clean air and clean water, focus on that court. Make sure that the retention vote is a yes, because that's also part of the play. If you get that court, like look what's happening to the EPA. I don't think the Environmental Protection Agency or any group trying to protect people's air quality and water quality has won a case in the U.S. Supreme Court. It's been pro fossil fuel, pro pollution, it's been so pro pollution that even the asbestos manufacturers feel emboldened enough to to challenge restrictions on asbestos, this absolutely horrible cancer causing material. So that's where we are on the federal level. So if you have any hope of protecting the sanctity of our environment here in Pennsylvania, you have to want these three justices to stay where they are. Same with LGBTQ rights. If you want to preserve gay marriage, I think gay marriage is on the chopping block. They're going to take away.
Absolutely.
They've given every indication, the U.S. Supreme Court has given every indication that they're going to use the guise of religious freedom in order to undermine LGBTQ rights nationally, including possibly taking away the right to marriage that they granted only a few years ago. And so that might also be a states' right issue to be determined under Pennsylvania's constitution. And who do you want making that decision? Do you want 5 MAGA judges, or do you want 5 judges elected as Democrats? And that's, before we forget, it's important to talk about, what the current composition of the court is. So our Pennsylvania Supreme Court has 7 justices. Right now, we have an advantage of 5-2. 5 of them are Democrats, elected as Democrats. 2 of them were elected as Republican. 3 of the Democrats are up for retention. Now, if we lose, we would end up with a 2-2 tie through the 2026 midterms. So all the shenanigans that the Republicans could unleash, all the shenanigans that the federal government could unleash in order to thwart voting in the 2026 midterms, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court will be hamstrung to address. That is why, a lot of these reasons are why they are spending the kind of money they are spending in order to get rid of these justices in a year, in order to confuse the hell out of our voters and embolden their voters to come to the court again, or come to the voting booth again, and further empower their MAGA allies in Pennsylvania. The stakes are enormous. And we can, if you want, we can give some attention to what the U.S. Supreme Court has done to voting rights, just as an example of what's at stake here in Pennsylvania as well, if you'd like.
Yeah, why don't we talk about that? Because, for me, it seems like, Trump and the MAGA GOP, they essentially want to set up a voting system across the United States, which is heads, Trump wins, tails, you lose, right?
Correct.
And the Supreme Court is their instrument in accomplishing that. So why don't we take a few minutes and just kind of highlight, some of the major issues that the Supreme Court is looking at and trying to undermine when it comes to voting rights in the United States and free and fair elections.
So it's important to go back a few years to, I don't know, Cyril, if you've ever watched the movie Selma.
Oh, yeah.
There's a lot of good movies about the civil rights, the work that the civil rights workers have done. But it's, for anybody listening, if you haven't seen Selma, I think it's on Netflix. You can watch it. I encourage you to do so, because it gives the context of why we needed the Voting Rights Act. So the basic history, and there's no way to do this justice in 10 seconds, but After the Civil War, we had a period of Reconstruction, a short period of Reconstruction where the federal government went down to the South and essentially at gunpoint compelled them to integrate the Black folks who had been slaves into society. That was not sustained for as long as it should have been. And then following Reconstruction, there was a period, what now scholars are calling a period of redemption, where there was essentially a clawing back of all the rights that had been granted to the Black folks. That, created Jim Crow, that created a system of separate but equal, supposedly, that created segregation, that created all kinds of voting repressions all throughout the country, not just in the South. And the movie Selma sort of captures what that moment was like in the 60s when you had just rampant disenfranchisement of Black folks. And so there's this march that happens, and John Lewis, who is a famous civil rights advocate and representative who passed away in the last couple of years, and for whom the Voting Rights Bill is named in order to try to restore the Voting Rights Act after the U.S. Supreme Court gutted it. But anyway, so he was instrumental in organizing civil rights actions, including this march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which was named for a former Grand Dragon of the KKK. So law enforcement waited on the other side of the bridge and violently attacked these civil rights protesters. And once the news got out, the American people were appalled. And then shortly thereafter...
And that was the march from Selma to Montgomery?
Correct.
Bloody Sunday.
Yep. So shortly thereafter, through pressure from Martin Luther King Jr. and John Lewis and the other activists, Lyndon B. Johnson signed the landmark civil rights legislation and in 1965 signed the Voting Rights Act. At the time, fortunately, the U.S. Supreme Court were the progressives of their day. They were very pro-democracy. Their jurisprudence was a pro-democracy jurisprudence. It wasn't this, garbage originalism that we have today. And the 1965 Voting Rights Act was considered the crown jewel of the civil rights laws. And you had this section of it, Section 2, which prohibited all voting practices that deny or abridge the right to vote on account of race or color. And then you had Section 5, which required certain jurisdictions, i.e. the former Confederacy, to get permission from the federal government before changing their voting practices. So they had to get pre-clearance, and it was designed to stop discriminatory policies before they went into effect. So instead of shifting the burden for citizens to argue that they were being disenfranchised by changes in the law required these former Confederate states to get approval from the federal government before changing their law. And it worked, and Section 5 required renewal every 5 years. Republicans were against Section 5 for all the reasons that you might think, and pursued an anti-voting rights strategy all along. But they couldn't really do anything about the Voting Rights Act because it was really popular. What they did was they appointed justices to the Supreme Court who effectively promised to neuter the Voting Rights Act. And Nixon appointed 3 justices to the Supreme Court. One was Justice Rehnquist, who as a clerk had written an opinion in favor of upholding the infamous separate but equal decision in Plessy versus Ferguson that was overruled by the Brown v. Board case. And then, you had Reagan expanding on Nixon's playbook, and he also appointed a young lawyer named John Roberts, who had clerked for Rehnquist to flush out their anti-voting rights strategy. And while working for the Reagan administration, Roberts had written memo after memo after memo outlining objections to the Voting Rights Act. And so in addition to elevating Rehnquist to chief judge, Reagan appointed Scalia, O'Connor, Kennedy to the court, and George H.W. Bush put Clarence Thomas on the court along with David Souter. And so as we know, in 2000, with the Gore v. Bush election, 5 of these Republican judges justices stopped the recount in Florida and basically declared George Bush the president of the United States by fiat. Bush's legal team included three young lawyers named John G. Roberts Jr., Amy Coney Barrett, and Brett Kavanaugh. Now, those names sound familiar. Obviously, three of them are now on the highest court in the land. And when I was saying earlier that we need to look at them as political actors, this is what I mean. So after Rehnquist passed away, George W. Bush appointed Roberts to replace him as chief judge. So the same guy who had spent his career in the Reagan administration writing screeds against the Voting Rights Act was now chief judge. And in a bit of foreshadowing, John Lewis testified against the confirmation of Roberts. And John Lewis, the great civil rights activist, wondered whether Roberts can really understand the depths of what it took to get the Voting Rights Act passed. And he correctly surmised that Roberts would be hostile to the Voting Rights Act. So, indeed, as soon as Roberts had the votes, he began taking a sledgehammer to the Voting Rights Act. And the first major blow was in the Shelby County versus Holder case. That was in that case, the court struck down the pre-clearance requirements that had kept jurisdictions with histories of discrimination from changing election rules without federal approval. And Justice Ginsburg, who was on the court at the time, issued her famous dissent, which compared getting rid of pre-clearance to something like throwing your umbrella away in a rainstorm because it was working. And so the practical effects now would be that the people that were being disenfranchised would now have the burden of proving that they were being disenfranchised. And John Lewis, again, who knew what it took physically, mentally, emotionally, he had put sweat, blood, his own blood, to pass this Voting Rights Act on the line. He characterized it as sticking a dagger in the heart of the Voting Rights Act, which it did. And as you can guess, Cyril, within hours of that decision, Alabama instituted a strict voter ID law. It closed all of these voting, these DMVs where people could obtain IDs. And you can kind of guess where all of those DMVs were located. It wasn't where the white people were. Texas quickly followed suit. Within 6 years of the decision, southern states closed more than 1,000 polling locations, obviously creating unequal burdens on Black folks. And within a decade, 30 states passed new restrictions on voting, limiting fair access to the poll. And the gap in racial turnout between 2018 and 2022 midterms grew by 8 points, which is significant. So that was the first of many, many blows to come. So we can spend a minute on that. But
I think what's important about this part of the discussion is that it serves as a reminder about how young actually democracy is in the United States, because before the Voting Rights Act of 1965, you can't really say that the United States was a democracy or a multiracial democracy, right?
That's correct.
It was more of an apartheid state. And, I was born in 76. So really, like when I was born, democracy was only 11 years old in the United States. And it also kind of speaks to how fragile our democracy is. And again, the importance of courts, right?
Yep.
Not only the US Supreme Court, but also of the state Supreme Court, and how ideological bad actors, if they're appointed to these courts, or in this case elected to these courts, can kind of like roll us back to pre-1965, which is really, I think, at least a starting point about where the so-called Make America Great Again movement wants to take the country to. I think it
Yep,
starts like before the Voting Rights Act, and I would say even would want to take us back to like the Supreme Court of like the 1850s and 1860s, right?
that's right. And even as far back as the
Yeah,
1700s, like, in Alito's Dobbs decision, he was favorably quoting a guy who was a witch hunter, effectively. So that nothing is off base when your theory of jurisprudence is that the Constitution is dead, and the way you interpret it is by going back to the intent of the original founders. And so that it also highlights just how powerful this court is, right? Like, and how powerful state supreme courts are. If you're granted the power to do something that the Congress couldn't do or didn't want to do, like Congress had passed the Voting Rights Act with something like 92 votes in the Senate, or even higher, shortly before the U.S. Supreme Court declared the law unconstitutional. So that's the kind of power the court wields when it wants to, when it isn't just freely giving its power over to the executive branch. So that's the other thing to highlight. Well, so the next big case, and this is directly impacting Pennsylvania, is the case called Rizzo versus Common Cause in 2019. This is the case where the court washed its hands of gerrymandering. It said that the federal courts, if gerrymandering is your problem, the federal courts are off limits. We're going to take the federal courts off the map as a way to fight gerrymandering. And take that to its logical conclusion. What does that mean? It means that if you are in Texas and your state Supreme Court is all Republican, then you have no choice but to live with gerrymandered maps, because there's no relief coming to you from the US Supreme Court. If you are in Missouri and your legislature and your state Supreme Court are all Republicans, guess what? There's no way out of gerrymandering. And as we discussed, if gerrymandering is politicians pick their voters with precision, then there's no way of getting rid of politicians who are not doing the bidding of the voters. It's inconceivable, because so many people vote uninformed. So many people vote, without full information, or it's so easy when you spend a ton of money misleading people, as we're seeing here in Pennsylvania. It's so easy to confuse people, to mislead people. And folks don't know enough about civics, don't know enough about the role of courts, don't know enough about the current events. And so they get a mailer that says that the Pennsylvania Supreme Court is making voting unfair. Oh, you know what? Maybe that's persuasive enough for them to go out and vote on that. So it's super easy. Like, obviously, we have to talk about Citizens United and the impact that has had, and that was also a gift from the U.S. Supreme Court to the billionaire class. Where they effectively said you can spend as much money as you want, on political elections, and that's protected as free speech, which is truly insane. And it has brought us the world that we are living in today, where you can have one billionaire spend something that to you and I would be the equivalent of $50. Like, for him, spending $2 million is nothing, is absolutely nothing. When you're talking about the richest man in Pennsylvania, he could blow 20 million and it would be nothing. And to have that kind of outsized influence just because you happen to be wealthy, in order to mislead voters, in order to confuse voters on the other side, in order to buy yourself as many state house seats or congressional seats as you can afford, which it's an outrage. Like, every person in this country who cares about democracy, who cares about equal access to whether it's the courts or the voting booth, should be outraged by that decision, and should be working to get money out of politics, and should ask all of their politicians to swear off corporate donations or dark money PACs or things like that, or at least when they're in power, to do everything in their power to get rid of Citizens United, whether that be by constitutional amendment or some other restriction. So anyway, it's important to talk about the Rizzo case because it emphasizes just how critical the Pennsylvania Supreme Court's gerrymandering decision, in contrast to that, was. Luckily for us, luckily for us, we had the Pennsylvania Supreme Court who was able to declare the terribly gerrymandered maps that were in effect in 2016, 2017 unconstitutional under our Constitution. Because if they hadn't, particularly voters in the collar counties, like where we are, Chester County was looked like something that, it was just, you'd look at it and be like, wow, who drew this? Like, who drew this crazy, insane looking map in order to reach way into Lancaster County and dilute the votes of voters in Chester County and in Montgomery County and Delaware County by inserting like all these middle of the state townships and counties into our maps. Fortunately, our Supreme Court said no, that violates our Pennsylvania Constitution. It may not, according to the Supreme Court, it doesn't violate the U.S. Constitution, but it violates the Pennsylvania Constitution. So, but here's the rub: that decision can be overturned. As Clarence Thomas announced a week ago, precedent is for suckers, effectively. Just because the Pennsylvania Supreme Court decided in 2018 that gerrymandered maps were unconstitutional under the Pennsylvania Constitution, it doesn't mean that a 7-2 Republican controlled Supreme Court won't come in and say, ignore that precedent, that court didn't know what they were doing. We're going to adopt an originalism jurisprudence and say that gerrymandering doesn't violate the Pennsylvania Constitution. Don't think it can happen. The exact same thing happened in North Carolina. North Carolina declared its maps unconstitutional under the North Carolina Constitution. That's when the Democrats had an advantage. They lost two of the justices in an election. They were replaced by Republicans. Shortly after they were replaced by Republicans, those Republicans said, never mind, forget that decision that the gerrymandered maps were unconstitutional under the North Carolina Constitution. We take it back. And sure enough, North Carolina is gerrymandered to hell today. And gerrymandered to hell means that even though it's considered a swing state, Republicans have a 10-3 advantage. 10-3. In a state that should be 50-50, maybe the Republicans get one extra seat. No, it's 10-3. That's the kind of maps that they want to draw here in Pennsylvania.
Well, here's a silver lining that I want to bring up. If you look at history shows that people power, social movement organizing is a cure for these kinds of political and social ills, right? Like the progress we've made in this country isn't because we've had, these enlightened leaders, is because there's been pressure from the grassroots, from the bottom up, as a result of, political organizing and political activism that have helped make our country a little more democratic, whether it's women organizing around the 19th Amendment, or, we were talking about these civil rights gains, right? That was people putting themselves on the line in marches like John Lewis, or just through education, whether it's through the Freedom Schools or the Highlander Institute, which was very, instrumental, that were educating or organizing organizers, right? Teaching people about, organizing their communities, or, how to employ civil disobedience in their acts. So I think this is something that like people need to kind of read up on and remind themselves about, especially before, because this is the type of history that they want to ban from schools, right? This progressive history of people power kind of making our country more democratic. So, what people can do is in their communities, you can organize teach-ins about what's at stake with these, judicial elections here in Pennsylvania. And then just, about, the broader elections coming up, another thing, and this is a separate topic, but like school board elections are very, very important in Pennsylvania and across the country, as we've seen over the last 4 years. So, I think it's not all doom and gloom. There's a lot at stake, but I think if communities and people organize themselves, we can overcome these kind of like barriers that we're facing right now. But Garen, to close us off, I was wondering, can you just take a few more minutes and just kind of like sum up and underscore the importance of why voters must retain Christine Donahue, Kevin Dougherty, and David Wecht for the Supreme Court in Pennsylvania?
No, absolutely. And what I want to highlight is that this erosion that we see in voting rights on the federal level, what the Supreme Court is doing is not just limited to voting rights. I used voting rights and we discussed mostly voting rights as an example of how the Supreme Court is the driving force that is eroding our democracy. For God's sakes, Cyril, 2 years ago, could you ever imagine roving bands of heavily armed masked men in our neighborhoods, snatching people out of their cars, smashing windows, smashing into their homes, taking them to dark sites somewhere, like to never be heard from again, like whether they're citizens or not? Could you have ever imagined that that would be the United States? I mean, if you could, then I credit you for, for being that kind of.
No, I mean the thought of the president having his own paramilitary force still blows
Right.
my mind. And and speaking to that, like one of my worries moving forward is if we're going to see this as well as like federal troops like the National Guard patrolling polling places.
Right. Right.
That's another worry of mine, even though I believe it's against the law for federal troops to interfere in national elections. Like that's something
It
that,
is.
I don't think is beyond the realm of the realm of possibility of happening next year for the midterms.
No, and the people who were arguing against presidential immunity were using what they thought was far-fetched examples of the president deploying SEAL Team 6 to murder his political opponents as, as saying like, if you grant immunity, this is plausible. And now what we're seeing is unilateral executions of people accused of drug smuggling in the Caribbean. Like, where there's no due process, there's nothing. They're just, we have to trust the administration that the people they're murdering in our name were really drug traffickers, and do drug traffickers deserve an instant death sentence from above? Like, and if they do, like, and they're now trying to declare people who think who regard this administration correctly as a fascist organization as enemies of the state. Like, what's next? And so this Supreme Court, our Supreme Court, are critical, whether we're talking about eroding democracy or strengthening it. But they're doing it in all these areas. Like, voting rights is an example, but reproductive rights, environmental rights, LGBTQ rights, civil rights in general.
Free speech.
How about, yeah, good old due process rights, free speech rights, like the right to not be deported to another country without a hearing? Like, geez, like, this is how far we have come. And again, like going back to how we started this discussion, if the idea here is hang on to the democratic institutions that you have now, we need to hang on to this Supreme Court in Pennsylvania, because we have very little recourse in the federal courts for the foreseeable future until we figure out a way to reform the U.S. Supreme Court. And in the face of all of this, corruption, this cruelty, this chaos of the regime, we need to remain furious. We need to remain defiant and determined. And if we don't want Pennsylvania to turn into North Carolina, or worse, something like Texas and Florida, we need to make sure to do everything in our power to get out there, to talk to people, and retain this Democratic majority in the Pennsylvania Supreme Court.
Garen, thanks so much for joining us today and for talking about, the importance of this, election. If you care about democratic rights, democratic norms, democratic institutions, you want to make sure you vote on November 4th and vote yes to retain Pennsylvania Supreme Court Justices Christine Donahue, Kevin Dougherty, and David Wecht. Garen, thanks again for coming on, and I hope you'll come back again soon.
Thanks, Cyril.
This has been The Signal, a podcast by the Bucks County Beacon. I'm Cyril Migaleko, editor-in-chief and host. For more progressive news, analysis, and opinion from Bucks County and beyond, go to www.buckscountybeacon.com.